Hello and welcome to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Thursday, March 7th. We have a couple of injury updates that we will be touching on in the show today. That is as far as the NBA. Karl-Anthony Towns of the Minnesota Timberwolves has been reported to have a meniscus injury, potentially have torn it, and as a result, he is out indefinitely, which could definitely impact the overall landscape of the playoffs in the Western Conference. LeBron James, additionally, left last night's game against the Sacramento Kings with an ankle injury, the same injury that was bothering him coming out of All-Star Weekend. So we will touch on both of those topics before switching to some NFL, where the Buffalo Bills yesterday made a handful of transactions, including cutting 6 of their players, many of them being big-time guys for them. So we will touch on that and then finally wrap up the show by talking about just some various moves that have been taking place, some very interesting releases across the league from the Bills and elsewhere as well. But before we get into the content of the show, just a reminder to like and follow wherever you may be keeping up with us, and for any of our live viewers to use the comment section, make this show as interactive as possible, and to make sure that your comments get the priority they deserve, to use the link gsmcpodcast.net. Any tips or donations would be greatly appreciated. But getting into our first segment of the day here, and Karl-Anthony Towns, where he was diagnosed this morning with a meniscus injury. Now, there's been a little bit of conflicting reports here as to whether or not it has been confirmed that his meniscus is torn, but it seems to be leaning in that direction. He is listed out indefinitely, so this is a brutal blow for a Minnesota team that is currently sitting at the top of the Western Conference standings. They have the second best record in the NBA, so this is a really tough blow for them and for Minnesota fans in general that were having, one of the best seasons of the past couple decades. The Timberwolves have not been necessarily an elite franchise as a whole, and now once everything seems like it is sort of shaping together, they get hit with this, and it is really unfortunate. And I guess it comes down to how long Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be out, but I do think that in the short term, this isn't necessarily the blow that it could be to other teams when you talk about losing their second best player on the roster. Obviously, Karl-Anthony Towns is an incredible scorer. I know that sometimes the maturity and the consistency with him can be a little bit questioned, but there is no doubt he has improved on the defensive end, which has been a big step for the Timberwolves, and just the pure scoring that you get out of him is, of course, very impactful. But I actually do think that for the Timberwolves here, they went out and they gave backup center Naz Reid a contract extension this past offseason because of the fact that he is a very good player. I think that he shares a lot of characteristics for Cat that could be utilized to help keep this Minnesota team afloat. Now, you lose a little bit of a depth, and that's why, as we start to talk about the playoffs, obviously a deep run would be very detrimental to not have Towns, but I think that Naz Reid is potentially a better defender. He can also shoot from outside as well, and he provides a lot of positive aspects for this Timberwolves team that I think, again, on a game-to-game basis, they wouldn't be necessarily torn apart by the absence of Karl-Anthony Towns. And again, I don't want to undermine how good Cat is, of course, but I think that it's more so a statement on Naz Reid and how he can be a very reliable guy. I thought that there were some Karl-Anthony Towns trade rumors this past offseason, and honestly, I mean, at that point too, we were looking at where his fit with Rudy Gobert next to him was not really working out necessarily, but he took strides in order to improve that way. The Minnesota Timberwolves offense as a whole sort of worked out some of those kinks, but Naz Reid is still an incredible option for them, and I think that he can eat up at least a lot of these regular season minutes, and depending on a playoff matchup, they could still get through a first round series, because you're not going to get the level of offensive production necessarily from Reid, but he still shoots 41% from beyond the arc, which is, of course, very impactful for them. This is a team that is built more so on their defense than anything else. And again, I think that Reid is a very passable option for Towns, who he's, again, taken steps in the right direction on the defensive side of the ball, but I still don't view Towns as an elite defender necessarily. And I think that when you talk about Reid here, he still has the size to, match at least some of it. He's 6'9". It doesn't at all take away from how big this Minnesota Timberwolves team is. That is one of the first things you talk about in terms of what you see them as in terms of a playoff threat. But again, it's once you get into some of those deeper playoff series, specifically I'm looking at the Nuggets, because that is the team in the Western Conference right now that has the target on its back. In order to make it out of the Western Conference, you are likely going to have to be the one to take down the reigning champs. And this is where I grow a little bit more concerned, because I think that you need a plethora of big bodies to try and match up with Jokic. He's not necessarily the crafty type of player that is seeking out tons of contact and trying to get himself to the free throw line, but you still do need to be able to throw out a variety of different looks. The ball movement with this Denver Nuggets team, I know that we talked about yesterday on the show, it feels though some of that ball movement has been a little shaky with the Nuggets as a whole. They've been turning the ball over a lot more frequently than it typically feels like they should be, considering the level of playmakers that they have on that roster. But again, I think that for the Wolves here and their overall aspect, it shouldn't be too much of an overreaction. Now, the top of the Western Conference, of course, is very tight in terms of seeding. So yes, while they are the number one seed, they are actually tied in terms of games back with the Thunder, and with just the Thunder, the Nuggets are one game back. So still very contentious. I don't think there's going to be a drastic fall off though with how their regular season goes from here. Now, it's interesting because, again, one way or another, they are likely going to have one of the top seeds in the Western Conference. I mean, realistically, let's say they go on this horrendous losing streak down the stretch of the year. There's not that much left in the season, just about 20 games for a lot of these teams. I believe they have 20 exactly, and they are 6 games ahead of the 5th seeded New Orleans Pelicans. So in all likelihood, they are going to host a playoff series. And you look at some of these teams towards the bottom of the play-in tournament and that threshold, it is the Sacramento Kings, Dallas Mavericks, Golden State Warriors, and LA Lakers. I think that all of those teams, minus the Lakers, are very small on the defensive end, and I've talked up the Mavericks a lot at times. I think that they're a very entertaining team to watch, but that defense has only gotten worse and worse. I think that for as tremendous of a season as we are seeing from Luka Doncic, and I absolutely am not trying to put him down, some of the defensive statistics with him are pretty alarming. I came across a website as of late. It's free for everyone. It is centersculture.com, and what it does is have a lot of game logs that provides more of a defensive perspective on a lot of these games and shows points allowed, what kind of field goal percentage you allowed. And again, a lot of this can be subjective at times, but I think that Luka is being very heavily attacked himself, and that's fine. Obviously Luka is there for the offensive centerpiece more than anything else, but it starts with him, and I think that just the team as a whole, the perimeter defense is very alarming to me. I like what Derek Lively has been able to produce for them, but he did get injured the other night as well, or at least was limited in minutes in their matchup the other night. As I quickly look through my notes here, that was a game against the Pacers where they allowed 137 points as a whole. Pacers are a tremendous offense, but again, I'm not trying to go on too much of a Mavericks rant here specifically, but again, just these teams as a whole. Sabonis is another one. He's incredible, but when he gets matched up against size on the other end, I think that he can be a lot more vulnerable. Now, a statistic came out last night that Sabonis is now 9-0 in his career against Anthony Davis, which is pretty incredible, honestly. I mean, Davis last night really struggled in the Lakers' loss. We're going to be getting into more of that in the following segment. But again, I just think that these other teams that are in the play-in tournament can definitely be taken advantage of with size, with good defense. And I do think that the Timberwolves are able to do so even if they don't necessarily have Towns. Now, I'm not sure what the exact typical time length is for a torn meniscus. It obviously doesn't sound good, and I think that it's a very real chance that Towns could be out for the remainder of the season, which would be really devastating for the Timberwolves and their fans who have been looking forward to finally having a real chance in one of these series. Obviously, the past, season and 3/4, call it, the past 2 seasons have been pretty up and down with them in terms of the Gobert trade, seemingly overpaying for him when it first came out. Then the fit was ugly. The team imploded on themselves at the end of last regular season with Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert fighting, with Jaden McDaniels injuring himself, punching a wall that took him out for the playoffs. And now to come into this year with a refined Anthony Edwards and looking to... now they have that real identity, and it's all sort of worked out in a way that has them at the top of their conference, and now they could potentially be, again, I don't think so, but they could potentially be without their second best player, their all-star player, and potentially be bounced in the first round. Would be pretty devastating. And I'm still not selling stock on the Timberwolves in terms of if you were to have their over-under for season total wins. They're probably already close to it as it is, but I don't expect this big drop-off in terms of their production for the rest of the season, and I still think they could very likely win a playoff round without Karl-Anthony Towns. I think you could maybe make an argument that in terms of impact, I don't know. I don't want to make this a slanderous thing by any means, but I think what Rudy Gobert brings on the defensive side is so crucial to them, being their interior anchor, having the size. Towns was a nice add-on to that size, but Naz Reid, again, standing at 6'9", he can fill some of that void as well. I also think that we saw how they played without Mike Conley for stretches this year. And Mike Conley, he's obviously at a more advanced age now at this point. I think that it's been almost a little bit telling about the rest of the team that they have been relying on this 36-year-old point guard as much as they have, but just in terms of initiating their offense and getting high quality looks, it's part of the reason why some of their crunch time offense hasn't been quite as smooth as you would ideally want from them. But again, I think that, there are still a lot of very impactful players in this starting lineup for them, and I think that the way that they typically play these games means that in terms of being a defensive force and having a lot of the pressure that you put on other teams on the defensive side of the ball, I think that it means if you lose out on a little bit of scoring, you can still get away with it to some degree. I think there's a good chance that this could catapult Naz Reid into more consistent starter discussions in terms of where he goes from here, where the Timberwolves are likely going to have to make some financial decisions. And I think that Reid is a very high quality player that is about to get some good attention as a result of this opportunity. But that is all we have time for on this subject. We are going to be taking our first break of the day. When we come back, we will be talking about the Lakers and the updates on LeBron James' injury. So stick with us and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just finished up talking about the impact of Karl-Anthony Towns' injury, and now we are going to be sticking in the Western Conference with a different injury update, and that is with LeBron James and the Lakers. He left early in that matchup with an ankle injury. Now, he missed the first game coming out of the All-Star break with an injury to that same ankle as well. So this becomes a little bit concerning. I've been pretty steady on how I've felt about the Lakers throughout the course of the year, that no, you don't necessarily want to play them in a playoff series. I still think that LeBron James can elevate his play to a level that makes any series competitive, and you don't want to get in the way of that. But at the same time, there are a lot of concerns with this team, and while to some degree the supporting cast issues have dwindled some, at least you can at least trust some of them to be reliable on offense, the Lakers defense has still really struggled for a while now. We saw them have a very bad February where they were 19th in defensive rating, and it hasn't gotten much better since then. They did have a nice defensive performance the other night when they played the Thunder, so credit there. But they take a step back with this loss to the Kings, who are sitting as the 7th seed, one of these other teams that the Kings are fighting for playoff spots with. And it might be a little bit overstated at times, but this idea of trying to be a 7th or 8th seed over a 9th or 10th seed in the play-in tournament is a big deal to a fair degree, I suppose, when it comes to when you are a 9 or 10 seed, you have to win 2 games, and the second game is guaranteed to be on the road in a do or die position, as opposed to being in the 7th or 8th, having multiple chances to win and guaranteed at least one home game. So the Lakers are trying to climb up in the standings here. The Kings going into this game were just 1.5 games above them, and this sets them back in a couple different ways. Of course, with the result itself, this wasn't a very competitive game. The Kings were up by 20 in the third quarter. They were running up and down the court on the Lakers, and to make matters worse, LeBron James ends up leaving this one with this ankle injury. And it's now being speculated that LeBron might not be playing in the second nights of back-to-backs down the stretch of this season. And while making sure that he stays healthy is more important than, for the playoffs that is more important than the idea of them winning these regular season games and worsening the injury, it still is a big deal. Now, if you look at the Lakers' schedule down the stretch of the year, it looks like they only play 2 sets of back-to-backs down the rest of the year. So again, nothing to necessarily overreact about, but still a concerning sign if you are a Lakers fan and you are hoping that they can sort of come into shape as a true contender. That sort of feels like a long shot at this point. Now, I suppose it depends on what your definition of is contender. When it comes to them winning the finals, I don't see it. I don't think that this team can win 4 consecutive rounds. I think that they could be a very scary first round matchup, and we just talked about the Timberwolves potentially losing Karl-Anthony Towns for a series. I still would pick the Wolves over the Lakers in a series, but that is a big-time development. The Lakers have some of that size to match up against the Timberwolves. I just referenced the win that they had against the Thunder earlier this week. That's a series where, fully healthy, I definitely think that the Lakers could steal that one as well. And what we saw with them last year was be able to capitalize on being a 7th-seeded team, going up against the 2-seeded Grizzlies, who had lost their starting center in Steven Adams and some of that size, and the Lakers were just able to overwhelm the Grizzlies physically. That was a young team. There's a lot of parallels that could be there to the Thunder as well. So I wouldn't rule them out for, potentially being a scare for a couple teams in the playoffs, but that also requires them making it through the play-in tournament in the first place. And for me, it's kind of hard to imagine that in these do-or-die games that LeBron would not be able to show up and this Lakers team would just fold. But you have the Warriors playing some of their best basketball. They just put on a rout of the Milwaukee Bucks last night after being embarrassed by the Celtics before they came back out and made a statement win. And for as bad as that loss to the Celtics did look at the time, you look at the Warriors here, they are 7-3 in their last 10 games, and they have been a significantly better team since Draymond Green returned from his suspension. And I just feel like with this Lakers team as a whole, they take a step forward, but then they take 2 steps back at the same time. And ultimately, for me, again, I think that LeBron James is able to will his team to a win, but if he's in a 9-10 situation too, having multiple of these opportunities, playing some of these other offenses that have perimeter scoring, that has been also a little bit harmful for the Lakers as well. They don't have a point of attack defender on the defensive side of the ball. You have to think who is going to guard Steph Curry. And the Lakers beat the Warriors earlier this year as well in one of the best games of the season. So I'm not calling it impossible. I'm definitely not counting them out, but the odds are really stacked against them right now. And ultimately, I just don't think that this season is really going anywhere. And that was a little bit of the design to some degree when it came to the trade deadline. They didn't go out and make a move, and I don't know what moves were necessarily out there that could have put them in real contention. Considering the lack of assets that they had, I would have loved to see them go out and get maybe a Dorian Finney-Smith along those lines, but when you hear the reports that the Nets turned down a Mavericks offer of multiple first-round picks for DFS, that becomes unlikely as well. And it just seems like the Lakers are what they are right now, and that's a team with LeBron James that can be scary on any given night, but they are massively flawed. And when you take into consideration the other teams in the Western Conference, how from top to bottom this conference does have a lot of talent, I just don't think that they can really see themselves as true contenders. And I don't think that many Lakers fans would tell you that. And again, they're looking to probably retool next year. It's interesting how this is going to play out with LeBron James on his he has a player option this year. It's $50 million. One way or another, he is likely expected to stay with the Lakers, and they'll have some extra first round picks to be able to trade to make another move. What that move still is yet, I'm not really sure. I think that the defense really has to be addressed though with this team, because I think that most of these other teams could really run them off of the floor, and it's just a big time concern for me. And I feel like I'm at a point here where I keep talking about the Lakers in these segments, and it's just because they are the brand that they are. It is a story. LeBron James is, of course, LeBron James, but I think that we're looking at a team that is just a tough first-round matchup and not much more. So I think that I am personally going to be looking to scale back on some of the Lakers content. I apologize for any of the viewers that are, big Lakers people or anything like that, but, I think that just the position that they're in now, it is not looking very good. Especially you think about the fact that they have been a bad team on the road this season, and that's what it's going to be likely in a play-in tournament game alone, and then be on the road against whatever top-seeded team should they actually make the playoffs. And they have a losing record against teams that are 500 or better. So they have these sparks, but ultimately I just feel like the consistency with them isn't there enough, and we are going to have to reevaluate the Lakers come this upcoming offseason. But that is all we have time for on this subject. We are going to be taking our second break, and when we come back, we will be moving on to the NFL and talking about the Buffalo Bills decisions, their roster moves from yesterday. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just finished up talking NBA for the day. We will now be moving on to the NFL and with the Buffalo Bills. Just a reminder for any of our live viewers to feel free to use the comment section, give in your opinions, and make this show as interactive as possible. But talking about the Bills here, they made some headlines yesterday by making a series of moves that included releasing 6 players in order to try and get their salary cap situation put together. They were about $40 million over the cap headed into yesterday. So they took some action in order to try and fix that to at least some degree. They still sit over the salary cap today, but they had to make some moves to at least move this in a positive direction for them. Some of the names that were released that were most notable were Jordan Poyer, their safety, Tre'Davious White, and Mitch Morse, their center. They also released Deontay Hardy, who has been a key special teams player for them for the past few seasons. They also released Naheem Hines and Siren Neal as well. They restructured their contract with Von Miller as well to try and get this thing right. But like I mentioned, despite all of these moves, they are still currently over the salary cap. This moves them closer once Tre'Davious White's contract clears, which will be in the summer. It will approximately free up $37 million, but they are not going to be done with moves. There has been some speculation about a Stephon Diggs trade as well, so we will get into all of that. But as far as the conclusion of some of these moves that have actually taken place, you have Jordan Poyer, who did take a step back last season. He is still probably in that upper echelon of safeties in the NFL. Now, he didn't have quite as good of a season as his past couple years where he was an All-Pro 2 seasons ago. He was, 3 seasons ago now, a Pro Bowler 2 years ago, and last year was a solid player for them, but wasn't quite the same impact. And he's 32 years old, so sort of the natural age regression with him. He was still very solid in the run game, but not the same level of passing defender. And he was set to take up $7 million in the cap space for them, so they decided to let him go. Tre'Davious White, another guy in their secondary that they are moving on from. White was one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL for a couple years there, but injuries have been the big-time story with him. He tore his Achilles about midway through this past season. He had torn his ACL in 2021 and just hasn't really been able to stay on the field for this Bills team that is hoping to be Super Bowl contenders. And while both of these players in the secondary have been effective for them, it just hasn't resulted in the postseason success. Notable that the other starting safety they had, Micah Hyde, is in expiring contract, so he will be a free agent this summer as well. So we could see a lot of turnover with this. And to avoid being too gimmicky here in terms of this conversation now is being asked, is the Buffalo Bills championship window closed? I will always think that as long as you have one of those top tier quarterbacks, which I believe they do have a top 3 guy in Josh Allen, to say that now the Bills cannot win a Super Bowl, I think that is an overreaction. Now, the odds are absolutely stacked against them. And if you replay how this past season went a handful of times after the slow start that they had to the year, then you can definitely make an argument that the more times you play this out, they probably don't make the playoffs, the Bills do, because they were, of course, really struggling in the first half of the regular season. They were 5-5, they were 6-6, and a lot of things had to break in the right way in order for them to make the playoffs, and ultimately they did. They cleaned up their business as well, winning their last 5 games of the regular season. But some of those other teams that were competitive for the 7th seed weren't able to do so. The Jaguars fell off big time. The Steelers, who did make the playoffs actually, but even them, they were competing with a team there who had a quarterback injury, quarterback controversy, whatever you want to call it, between once Pickett was back and it was Mason Rudolph taking over and all of that. But you just had a lot of these other teams that were in contention fall out. You had Joe Burrow go down with his second injury of the season. I just think overall as a whole, when you look at how this Bills season played out, to imagine that they ended up being the 2 seed was pretty incredible. So that being said, I still feel like if injuries aren't the same in the playoffs, losing a lot of their linebackers as well, that things still could have gone better for them. But ultimately, the conversation is with the Bills here. You are in the same conference as Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and that is sort of the measuring stick here, where it is for Josh Allen and it is for the franchise as a whole, the way that we have seen the Chiefs retool around Patrick Mahomes. Now, I don't even want to give the front office too much credit in some points, because some of the receiver moves that they made were definitely not good. They were able to survive off of having this all-time talent in Patrick Mahomes at quarterback. They had Travis Kelce, who wasn't quite as effective as we've seen in the past, but once the playoffs came around, there was still that relationship between him and Mahomes. Kelce is still good enough to be an effective player, but they were able to sort of shift their identity this past season to having an elite defense. And this was a defense that I don't think I fully gave enough credit to for a lot of the year. We knew how good their secondary was. They had some good linebackers, but it didn't, just based off of the numbers, their run game against the run, that was something that I was way too fixated on, I think, for a lot of the year. And ultimately, it was their defense that really carried them all through the playoff run. And it was an incredible job, I think, for them to be able to pivot after being the high-flying offense with Patrick Mahomes, and still having Patrick Mahomes, of course, but we talked about some of the stats with Russell Wilson when we looked at the shift of offense that they had during the course of the season, and how his air yards per pass were in the bottom 4 of the NFL. Patrick Mahomes was even lower in terms of air yards per completion, and that was because of the fact that the defense wasn't really, or the receivers, that is, weren't really to be trusted in the same position, and the fact that they also knew that they could rely on a defense. And as opposed to the first few years of Mahomes' career, where he could just throw the long ball to a burner like Tyreek Hill and have him do the rest, it was a lot more methodical driving. Luckily, they had an improved run game with Isaiah Pacheco, who, again, was a late-round pick for them as well, so it's not even like they knew that this was going to be a home run swing for them. They had Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who was a first-round pick for them a handful of years ago, but they found the running back late in the draft that was able to carry the workload for them and ultimately help put them into a position where they won back-to-back Super Bowls. So it's hard to be critical of the Chiefs front office there, but then when you look at the Bills, now they're going to have to come back into this sort of altered state where they need to find a way to rebuild around Josh Allen. And I think rebuild is almost even a little bit of a stretch, where it's not like they need to tear down their entire roster and start over. It's just a matter of they're going to need to especially hit on some of these draft picks, because they've been a little bit hit or miss over the course of the past handful of years. They have drafted just 2 all-pro players in the past. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I think it's when you go back to 2017. It was whatever draft with Tre'Davious White and Matt Milano. Since then, they have not drafted an all-pro player for themselves. Now, they've done a fine job of sort of working around the edges, signing some former guys with draft pedigree, and bringing them in to be effective players for them. But in terms of actually homegrown talent, we just haven't seen it yet. Maybe Gregory Rousseau makes a jump for them. He's somebody who they drafted in the first round a couple years ago, and he's shown some flashes, but he hasn't been the elite round 1 edge rusher. And, it's hard as well. They draft in the latter half of the first round every year as well, so it's not like they're getting necessarily chances for those home run swinging players, but you still need to do more, take advantage of some of these cheaper contracts in terms of your production, especially as Josh Allen's salary is going to take a massive jump with his contract extension, which also sort of brings me into the conversation about Stephon Diggs and how this situation is going to play out for them, because Stephon Diggs, for as great of a talent as we know that he is, some of the production, in the playoffs as a whole, hasn't been necessarily tremendous since coming to the Bills. The playoffs hasn't really been there, but he is still, this year especially too, with some of the regular season stuff, he just sort of fell off a cliff some, and now he's going to be making almost $28 million for the Bills next season, and that's a lot of money to cough up to one guy in particular. What are they going to do in terms of keeping him on the books? They still have some ways to go in terms of getting under the financial cap, and I think that it is going to be a very interesting thing to see how this all plays out for them. Peacock is in the chat right now talking about hearing Russell Wilson to the Steelers. We'll briefly touch on this. This is something that we'll talk about a little bit in the final segment as well. They are looking to meet the two parties later in the week, but it is interesting because Russell Wilson seems like he would be a pretty good fit there in the Pittsburgh Steelers offense and the franchise, but at the same time, we've had multiple reports come out about the fact that the Steelers don't want to bring in a veteran quarterback. The Athletic just put out an article yesterday talking about how they are not interested in bringing in Wilson. The 3 that were listed was Wilson, Kirk Cousins, and Baker Mayfield, where I can understand it to some degree. I'm not entirely out on Kenny Pickett as a quarterback. I think that you should have somebody else in the building to put a little bit of pressure on him. Now, to what level of a quarterback is that? Russell Wilson's interesting because I definitely think that he still could potentially find himself playing some decent football for a team that is looking to actually elevate in the playoffs. The Steelers have all of these seasons where they avoid going under 500. They make the playoffs, but haven't won a playoff game in years now, and Russell Wilson could potentially be that. But there is also the fact of the matter that having Russell Wilson as a backup quarterback, if you were to go on the strategy that I think that the Steelers should do in keeping Kenny Pickett on the roster, but trying to light a fire under him a little bit, Russell Wilson would be a little bit of a distracting backup quarterback, in my opinion. So there's a lot of different conflicting things when it comes to the Wilson conversation. I'm really not sure how this is going to play out. I think that there is a chance that he could end up not being on a team in this offseason, continuing to work out and potentially finding his way back onto a roster should there be an injury to a starting quarterback elsewhere. Because again, I do think that he could potentially still have some good football in him, but for some of these franchises that have open quarterback positions, it might be tough to justify going with Wilson, even though he may be willing to take a cheap deal. So that is definitely a, positive, I suppose, if you are a franchise considering this. But we will get more to the Steelers and this Wilson meeting. We will be touching on all the other big releases from the NFL that took place over the course of the past 24 hours when we come back on the other side of this break. So stick with us and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We are headed into our final segment of the day, talking about the NFL players that are currently on the open market or are shortly to be on the open market. Just a reminder for our live viewers, if you want to join in the conversation, give your input on some of these moves, I will be happy to talk to you guys about some of these upcoming moves. We will start just a little bit. We talked about it at the end of last segment, but as Peacock mentioned, the Russell Wilson Steelers news, the two teams are expected to meet. Now, I'm not sure what the timetable quite is yet. It sounds like, at least from this most recent report, that the teams that Wilson and the Steelers have some mutual interest. The Steelers are so weird because they've been so back and forth in terms of what they're going to do at the quarterback position. And I will say, I am somebody who believes in Kenny Pickett to a certain degree. Not that he's ever going to pan out to be an elite quarterback talent, but I do still feel like he can run an offense. I think that the situation last year with Matt Canada was a little bit unfair to him, and there's still a bunch of weapons on that offense that they could potentially run with. Ideally, they have a little bit of a better offensive line. I feel like they should be looking to address that this offseason, but it does sort of tell you something that the team that gets to see him in the building every single day has been so up in the air about him, and the fact that there were also some additional reports that came right at the beginning of free agency about the fact that some of their receivers were actually wanting Mason Rudolph to be the starting quarterback next season. Now, I feel like if you're a Steelers fan, Mason Rudolph being the starting guy, now I know that he and the Steelers won some games down the stretch of the regular season, and they were able to make the playoffs. but I think that would be a really disappointing offseason, personally, if the plan headed into next year was having Mason Rudolph as your starting quarterback. Maybe I'm too harsh on it. I don't see the upside with it necessarily. And you're talking about a Steelers team that, again, is hanging around being above 500 every single season, but their last playoff win, I'll look it up right now, it had to have been somewhere around 2016 or along those lines. I don't think that Mason Rudolph really gets it done for you unless you are going to assume that you have a revamped defense or something along those lines where they were able to. 2016 was the last year that they've actually won a playoff game. I don't think Mason Rudolph elevates you. I think that he, again, I'll say last note here before, because I don't mean to get all over Mason Rudolph's case here. That's not really fair. But I think that he benefited a lot from George Pickens being able to house a handful of short routes and just show some of these flashes for him. Maybe it's a statement on the offense that Matt Canada was running. Maybe it's a statement on the ability of Kenny Pickett, but I don't see it there. I'm curious what they actually want in the building there in Pittsburgh, because it's been a lot of conflicting reports. Next team here is the Seattle Seahawks. On Monday, they made a handful of moves as well to try and make their financial situation better. They released Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, and Will Dissly. The moves saved them about $34.5 million. So they end up deciding to keep Geno Smith for the upcoming season. And now they make some of these other moves where Jamal Adams, we know, was once one of the best safeties in the NFL. Health has been a huge struggle for him the past couple seasons. That definitely hurts them. I think that the Seahawks as a whole here, they are going to be in a little bit of a transition, moving on from Pete Carroll, coming in with Mike McDonald, and trying to sort of reset some as he looks to take over that defense and put them in a little bit of a younger, more of an outwards looking product here. But as far as Jamal Adams hitting the open market, I know that health has been an issue for him. He's played just 10 games over the course of the past 2 seasons. He hasn't played a full season since 2018, but he adds to this very interesting safety market that is out there because like we mentioned in the last segment, Jordan Poyer of the Buffalo Bills, he was also released as part of their moves. He's a little bit on the older end. Jamal Adams is still just 28, so there is maybe still something there for him. But additionally, a big-time move that took place yesterday was the Broncos releasing Justin Simmons. Justin Simmons is one of the premier safeties in the league. Even still, he has been All-Pro second team in 4 of the past 5 seasons, including last year, where he was also selected to his second Pro Bowl. So I still definitely think, despite being 30 years old, there is something in the tank for him. And this makes a very interesting safety market as well. Everybody likes to talk about the running backs that are available, but I think there are a handful of teams that could benefit from some help in the secondary. Now, team, big market that everybody talks about. They're supposed to be all in this year. I think that the Dallas Cowboys should potentially look into this. Now, what that means in terms of financially, I'm not sure how much these guys are going to fetch in free agency, but I think that they could definitely benefit after the way that the playoffs worked out there and the collapse of their defense. I know that they more so need some linebackers, but I think that there is real room for them to go out, sign one of these guys a team that I'm really interested in terms of them making a move in the secondary, specifically at safety, is the Green Bay Packers, where they had some guys underperforming for them in the secondary last year, a very young team. I know that they're going to have contracts down the road here that they're going to have to serve out, starting with Jordan Love, but also with a bunch of their wide receivers as well. But I think that the Packers could absolutely benefit from taking advantage of one of these guys. I think that Justin Simmons would be awesome out there in Green Bay, but also if you wanted to go with maybe a Poyer where you're not going to pay him quite as long, you're not going to get necessarily the same production level likely as you would with a Justin Simmons, but could still bring in Poyer and have him fill a role. And the last team here that stuck out to me is the Detroit Lions, sticking in the NFC North. They are a team that is on the brink. They feel like they are right on the edge of it. That's why Ben Johnson came back to them and didn't accept the Washington Commanders job. The Lions feel like they have a real chance to run this thing back and potentially be Super Bowl champs this year. And I agree with them. I think that they have loads of talent. The one area, though, of course, that they were definitely lacking in last season was the secondary. Now, it was maybe a little bit more of a corner thing. Brian Branch came in for them last year at the second round pick out of Alabama. He played safety and he was tremendous. So maybe not a perfect fit necessarily. I'm sure they could figure out a way to make it work. I just feel like in general with that secondary, they could take upgrades wherever they may come. And it's just a team that sort of stuck out to me in terms of there is that much talent in the secondary that is available. Maybe you go with it. I also thought that Ifeatu Melifonwu was a nice developmental project for them over the course of the season as well. He and the safety blitzes that he brought were very impactful for them, but I also think that maybe getting more of a pass-first guy could be beneficial for them. Again, like Brian Branch a lot as well. Curious how we can see this all sort of work out for them. But some other moves that have taken place as of recent, we had Jonnu Smith being signed to the Miami Dolphins. Maybe not the blockbuster move by any means, but I'm curious about Jonnu because I am personally a Patriots fan, and his tenure in New England was atrocious. They brought him in, they gave him all this money, and then played an offensive system that didn't fit him whatsoever. The play-action heavy offenses that we saw him running in both Tennessee and then last season in Atlanta, where they had, of course, Arthur Smith, who was the offensive coordinator with him in Tennessee, then the head coach in Atlanta. That sort of system fit him a lot better, and he was a lot more effective again. Mike McDaniel is a tremendous offensive mind. I think that he will be able to unlock some of that talent that is still there with Jonnu, and I think it's another helpful player to bring in to help Tua here, as there is a very interesting offseason conversation as to whether or not we will see the Dolphins extend Tua this offseason. I've been on the record saying I don't think that they should. If anybody disagrees with me, speak up in the comment section, but I think that they should likely be looking to just play out how this season works out and then evaluate the situation from there. Last couple pieces of news here that I'll fly through a little bit quickly. Michael Thomas is expected to be cut from the New Orleans Saints. Thomas has, of course, been, as some people have called him, Slant Boy. I think he is a tremendous player still. Now, his best years definitely behind him, but I still think that he can be an effective player for a franchise out there. seeing as though I just mentioned being a Patriots fan, I wouldn't be mad whatsoever if he ended up on the Patriots. But I'm looking up right now what his current contract is at in terms of the Saints are another team that are in a miserable cap situation, and they need to look to move off of some of that money. And it looks like he would be making $12 million this upcoming year and could be on the books for a little bit longer as well. But I suppose it makes sense. The Saints have a lot of things they need to address this offseason, so trying to get out of some of that money might not be a bad decision for them. And then final note here is that it has been being reported that Saquon Barkley and the Philadelphia Eagles supposedly have mutual interest. Barkley was reported to have named the Houston Texans as his top target for where to sign. This came out last week or so. And I still think that the Texans, with all of the cap space that they have, should look to address the running back position for the upcoming season. I'm not saying roll out the Brinks truck for any one of these particular guys. I think that Josh Jacobs would be my top running back free agent of this class, but Saquon is right on par with him as well. I just feel like Jacobs is maybe a little bit safer in terms of injury history and in terms of running itself. I know that Saquon is a nice pass catcher as well, but it's funny because we've now seen the Eagles and the Cowboys both attached to Saquon Barkley. I know that's not something necessarily Giants fans want to hear, but it does seem to be a growing possibility. It all comes down to as well, I think just a plot line as a whole here with some of these running backs is the idea of how much money are they going to fetch in free agency, especially considering how many of them are available. Wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of one-year deals out of the group. I think that Josh Jacobs could fetch a multi-year contract. Saquon Barkley possibly could as well. But for a guy like Derrick Henry, who, keep in mind, he was second in the league in rush yards last season, and that was behind a subpar offensive line in Tennessee and with a pass offense that was pretty non-existent. I know that the age is there with him as he's now in his 30s, but I still think he is a tremendous runner, and I think that if you are a contender and you land him, it will be a big deal, and we could be in for a little bit of an awakening in terms of Derrick Henry really has been one of the premier running backs in the NFL. You could debatably call him a generational running back. I know that the success in the playoffs hasn't been there. He's a running back. Keep that in mind. He basically single-handedly almost put the Titans on his back for the couple of very successful seasons that the Titans had, helped make Ryan Tannehill look like a potential MVP at one point based off of, like we talked about with Arthur Smith and the Jonnu Smith deal. A lot of play action with that because Derrick Henry was also such a threat to run that teams were terrified of him. But we will keep you up to date on all of the developing stories on the GSMC Sports Podcast, where you can catch us on all streaming platforms. You can catch us on YouTube as well for exclusive short content as well. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock, so we will see you then. Have a good one, everyone.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn,